Molt bona tarda.
Good afternoon to all of you.
Em complau, doncs,
It's a pleasure
donar-vos la benvinguda
to welcome you
a aquesta sessió
to
al voltant de
this session
la CSW
regarding
66,
the CSW 66 Feminist Proposals to Achieve Climate Justice. It is a pleasure to welcome you at this event organized by the National Council of Women from Catalonia, which, as you know, has a long track record, and it has consultative status with ECOSEC going back 25 years, and it's been present at the Commission on the Status of Women in previous years. And we engage in these points of reflection. This year, the session is Feminist Proposals to Achieve Climate Justice. This is a product of the extractivist economic model and the consumption economic model, which has led to the destruction of so many natural resources. Climate change affects women and men differently, and it's not just a consequence of this economic model, but it's a consequence of this patriarchal system. The session will be very enriching because the council did a lot of legwork in advance to bring together feminists from Latin America and Catalonia who will share their experiences to confront this situation, and they will talk about their direct experience and the strategies which have been organized collectively and from a feminist perspective to claim women's rights and achieve climate justice. I hope you have a very enlightening session. I'm really looking forward to listening to everyone's contribution. I'll now give the floor to the second Vice President, Eugenia Bretones, to make her presentation, and thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, First Vice President and Executive Director of the ICD and the Vice President of the Council of Women in Catalonia. And I'd like to welcome our invitees from Latin America and Catalonia and the other people who are attending. Our event is part of the 66th session of the CSW in the UN. Before I go into detail, let me say on behalf of the coordinating committee, we demand an urgent de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and all the conflicts that are going on today. And we demand that people's lives be given precedence over geopolitical considerations. We want to recognize the voices of women from the North and the South. We are aware of our role as part of the European Union. We are aware of the need for economic growth, and we have to look for solutions with women from a feminist perspective, which will allow us to overcome the current extractivist economic model, which will allow us to sustain life and achieve climate justice. I want to thank the panelists today, Ms. Carolina Gutierrez, Andrea Vega, Blanca Bayas, who's from Catalonia, and we hope that we will have different strategies from the North and the South among feminists. You will discuss the involvement of women and girls in environmental programs and programs dealing with climate change, which are so necessary to reduce inequalities with a gender perspective and an intersectional perspective. Also, this alliance is necessary because these environmental issues affect the entire planet. In Catalonia, we support the Beijing platform and the conclusions of COP26, which took place in Glasgow. And now we will continue to demand that Catalonia, Spain, and the European Union allow women to participate in political decision-making and thereby contribute to the furtherance of our rights and objectives. At the same time, we help the planet. I want to thank Almudena Garcia, Alicia Olive, and my colleague, Laura Corominas, who works on creative work, and she's going to be the moderator. First, we're going to have a roundtable discussion with our panelists. We'll be talking about various aspects having to do with their proposals, and the second part of the debate will bring in our colleague Laura Dia del Valle, and at the end of the day, our president, Meritxell Benedí, will address the audience. So now I'll give the floor to Laura. I hope you will enjoy hearing all these feminist solutions and that this feminist solidarity can save the planet. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. Hello, good afternoon and good evening, depending wherever you are. I would like to, first of all, thank the director and the vice director for their comments. And I would like to thank all the participants and the attendees for engaging in this reflection on climate justice. Today, we're bringing together feminists from Latin America and the Caribbean and Catalonia to share experiences on climate change, to truly guarantee women's rights. As was already mentioned, we have 4 fantastic presenters, and there'll be 3 rounds. First, dealing with context, a second round where we'll look for feminine proposals, and secondly, and lastly, we're going to see what demands these feminists make of governments. And at the end of the roundtable, we will open up a space for debate. Well, and let me just introduce the 4 speakers. I'm going to be very quick because I can't go into their bios in depth because they are very active. Our first presenter is Yuria Sendiwin. She is a member of the executive committee of the Contemplative Study Group from the U.S. Academy of Religion. She works on indigenous transmission, and she works for environmental justice in the indigenous communities. Our second speaker is Blanca Bayas Fernández, who is a researcher in the Globalization Debt Observatory and an ecofeminist activist. Her work is focused on the defense of public services and alternative services from an ecofeminist and feminist economical point of view. She's written various articles, and her recent publication is called Ecofeminist Proposals to Rethink the Cities, Public and Community Path. Our third presenter comes from the border between Mexico and Guatemala, Carolina Gutierrez Palacios. She has a specialty in social work and has a master's degree in andragogy. She works on studying migration, social organization, and sexual and reproductive rights. Carolina works in the central migratory corridor between Mexico and Guatemala. And last but not least, Andrea Vega Troncoso, who is a very young feminist from the Dominican Republic. She lives in New York, and she works in WEDO, Women's Environment Development Association, and her work in this organization and is focused on advocacy for climate justice and gender justice in different areas of the United Nations. She graduated from Brown with a bachelor's in environmental studies and Latin American studies. These are our four speakers. And without any further ado, let's start the first round of questions for this round table. Let's have sort of a contextualization. We will speak directly in Spanish with three of the speakers and in Catalan with one of them. So with Yuria, in one of your articles, you affirm that women are continually discriminated against because of patriarchal, political, economic, and racial systems, and that they do not recognize the regenerative power of women who are so necessary to maintain the health of our planet. And violence against Mother Earth is violence against women and vice versa. To start, could you go into greater depth on this final assertion? I just wanted to introduce myself using my Maya indigenous language, and also I seek the recovery of languages. Regarding the question, I'm going to compare the different world views between the indigenous perspective regarding what is feminine and regenerative power and the nourishing power of Mother Earth and of women and what's happening now. That's what we are observing. It's very common to observe in indigenous worldview, the indigenous way of thinking, of learning, and of relating with each other. We see this power of the earth. We can see various traditions refer to the earth as our mother, as a first mother. Our Shoni sisters in North America, in Abiyala, have a tradition where shortly after birth, the first touch of a human being is with the earth. And so to intensify and emphasize this, that the fact that the first mother is earth, and after the baby is then handed over to her mother, these creations, these stories are constantly giving the feminine role a role of regeneration, a role of union with various living beings and with the community. We see this in indigenous traditions constantly. But what do we observe truly now, worldwide? It's been called solastalgia, which means pain of the place where you live. It's sort of an anguish. It has been generated because of climate change, because of the environmental changes which affect people, but when they're in their place of origin. And we find a high level of stress and depression worldwide, which affects women much more than men and much more young people than adults. So we're beginning to observe a change among women and men. They are much more threatened by the realities of climate change and by realities of oppression. But we also see that indigenous territories are threatened not only by the climate change, but there are also forced displacement because of these changes and because of armed conflict generated by extractive industries and capital-based industries. So there is a constant eating away at territories, and territories are affected by single cropping. So all of this idea of the creation and the regeneration of Earth is an exploitation, an extraction, or a capitalization of Earth. So we see that there is a genocide, not only in terms of biodiversity, as we saw in this sixth massive species extinction, but there's also cultural genocide. There is biocultural extinction. And these are very clear impacts going back to colonialization. They've been generated based on the abuse and exploitation of land and human beings, constant expropriation of territories by states and transnational companies which reach these places. And so we also see there that women and girls start to be profoundly affected by intergenerational trauma. We indigenous women have less access to education and health, even intercultural health. Our own health, traditional health systems are often persecuted or need to be validated by a Western medicine system. All of these ways we've observed that the indigenous women's capacity, women who are the protectors of the environment and of cultural value, especially in these areas where we have such a profound relationship with the earth, where we live in such close contact with the earth. What does it mean to be a human being inside a territory that's in contact with the environment? So in these contexts where there are forced migrations, or in these migratory contexts where women stay behind on the territory, transmitting knowledge, maintaining resources, nourishing the new generations, these women who are leaders, who are transmitters of culture, are also losing those positions because they are not given a voice. They don't exist. As soon as there begin to be relations with governments and companies, this is a constant abuse. The current global realities do not recognize the spiritual, cultural leadership of women and girls. Women who incarnate the creative and generative power of women, of what is feminine. And this continuous discrimination by systems that have been mentioned before, that are patriarchal. This is a constant oppression, not just because that power of women is not recognized, but because discrimination keeps us with deprived of decision-making power inside our own resources and our own territories, and on decisions that can affect our own lives. I think that at the end of the day, violence against Mother Earth is a way of seeing violence against women. It's a direct cultural product of colonization, militarism, extractivism, and a development model, because they induce poverty. And they overlook the efforts of so many women and girls in these areas.
Muchas gracias, Yuria, por...
Thank you so much, Yuria. I completely agree with everything you said, and I learned a new concept, nostalgia, the pain caused by where you live. You have given a name to all these forms of discrimination which are structural, and the anguish of life that is linked to climate change. And that's the perfect segue to our next speaker, Blanca. On the one hand, how does this climate change affect women's lives in the global north, especially in Catalonia, and how do the behavior of the global north, how does this behavior affect the life of women in the global south? And perhaps you could explain to us what impacts the next generation funds from the European Union will have on women and other vulnerable groups to achieve climate justice, in achieving climate justice. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for having invited us. Thanks for having invited and allowing us to participate in this roundtable with such a relevant, such a pertinent issue, which has to do with ecofeminism at the crosswords between feminist proposals and ecological proposals. I'm happy to see that you, in your introduction, you discussed this systemic crisis which we find ourselves in, dealing with human lives and affects ecosystems. We find ourselves in a dramatic context, an intersection of crisis. In this sense, the South, global South, is impacted, as Yuria just explained. The situation is quite dramatic, but the reality is that there are impacts throughout the planet, impacts on various territories, and the North, the global North is affected and also affects women and other groups that are vulnerable. We are moving, as you all know, the temperature is rising. We're moving towards a 2-degree increase above that of the pre-industrial era, and that leads us to awful extremes. Right now in Barcelona, in Catalonia, that it is raining very heavily in some areas that are a result of this climate emergency. These extreme weather phenomena, also droughts, lead to a drop in crops. As you know, the current pandemic has come about because of human impact on the territories. The diminution in crop yields, less access to drinking water. What is the reality? The groups that are more vulnerable, more poorer because of sexual division in work, women have less access to resources and we are more vulnerable. There's energy poverty caused by an extractivist reality which is affecting the global south. Mega infrastructure in energy is being built. These energy resources, when they reach our territory unfairly, we find ourselves in a situation of energy poverty in many households, which this affects single parent families, single women families. We don't have access to many basic rights. This leads to other phenomena such as housing crises. Another aspect of how the global north affects the global south. The same people who are responsible for us not having access to energy and food rights in the north and the lack of access to other resources in health, an impoverishment of public services here. The fact that we don't have access to these resources caused by the large corporations, these people are the same people who are responsible for massive extractivism in the territories of the South, leading to single cropping and leading to global, unfair global chains. Poor women who emigrate to the north and women who are left behind to do the hard work, women who are environmentally impoverished because of extractivism. What responsibility do we have? The owners of these large corporations are, in our view, responsible, but the politicians are also responsible. There is an alliance between the political power brokers and corporate managers. Consequently, these companies that are quite focused on agriculture and food and energy oligopolies. I won't talk about this unfair global chain because my colleagues will discuss this. What impacts may they have? I think this was the third question that you asked. The impact on women and other vulnerable groups because of the climate emergency. The next generation funds, but other proposals for economic recovery and planning, in our view, are being channeled, and they'll be the same recipes we saw, and they don't work. In our context, we've said this many times. We've talked about the importance of socially necessary work in economic recovery, which is being portrayed as being green. They're looking for public-private cooperation, but the private area is focused on major, large corporations. And we should commit we should commit to invest in public health, in education. So right now there's a lack of transparency based on how they are being channeled. The Spanish government is quite centralized, and here we're dealing with the Spanish central government. They're not working towards proposals where we can see to what extent there is sovereignty, where we could come up with a decentralized proposal for the autonomous communities or for municipalities to be able to make decisions and to commit more locally. Right now, everything is being taking shape through these public-private cooperation, and although they talk about this green ecological perspective, but we think they're reverting to renewable energy with the same companies. Renewable energy don't have a zero impact. They're being built with fossil fuels. And we don't like the way the recovery plans are making these proposals generally. I don't know how long I've been talking. Oh, that would be about it. It's perfect. It's perfect. Fine. Thank you. You covered all the issues. Thank you, Blanca, for this mapping of the direct linkage between historical structural issues from the north and how they affect the global south, and how these next generation funds are selling us false solutions. Everything pointed this out, but you just confirmed it to us. We talk about global care chains, and people go to the north, but the impoverished women are left behind. And based on that issue and what our other colleagues have said regarding the impacts of climate change and the results of extractivist industry, which are immigration, according to the High Commissioner on Refugees, in the next 50 years, there could be millions of displaced people because of climate change. And many of these migrants will be women. And I would like to welcome Carolina as one of the coordinators of this network of women, health, and migration. Carolina, could you explain us in very short fashion, because I know you're very active on many areas, what is the work of this network? It works on the migratory path between Mexico and Guatemala, and particularly, do you have any statistics, do you have any data on women who cross this border as a consequence of climate change and the extractivist mega projects? Thank you. Welcome to all of you. As a matter of fact, for us, it's a pleasure to be able to share this space with you and with our different working proposals. As our Mesoamerican Network, we have a strategy which arose as a necessity of women. The Mesoamerican Network came out as a result of a training program. We managed to identify some women's organizations in 4 countries: Guatemala, on the border with Mexico, Chiapas, El Salvador, Honduras, and also in the Federal District of Mexico. We set up the network. Some women's organizations, some are leaders in our territories. As a network, we have committed to alliances and advocacy because this Mexico-Guatemalan border was a border that was not so well known in the countries. And I think our network did a lot of advocacy for this border to be recognized, and so that there could be some organizational processes. We've worked on advocacy with in Guatemala and Chiapas in Mexico to be able to reflect the constant violation of human rights against women who are migrating. All of that led us to build other organizational processes, especially from the Mesoamerican Network. There was a network of defense of human rights in Guatemala on the border and Mexico in Chiapas. That's part of our work. And we've taken positions on various issues in the migratory process. We've emphasized human rights. We've worked on border issues with informational stands. We've worked with some state organizations. We've worked with human rights defenders. With regard to your Laura's question, we don't have official data, unfortunately, on the border area. Say in Quintantenango in Guatemala, we have 2 formal borders, and there are more than 100 blind angles where immigrants cross, and there's no border checkpoint, and there's a process of supporting various organizations. So we don't have official data. There is research, there are studies, but their results are not official because the government is not offering those data. There is an institutional system which might be attentive to the registration of women who migrate. We don't have that information, but in our Mesoamerican network, we can tell you that we can make a projection. It's not a definitive projection, but it is a projection which we carry out as on the basis of our investigation and our study. We calculate that over the course of a year, 200,000 women might migrate through there. We've noted that at certain points in time, there are teenagers, there are adults, and sometimes women who travel with their family, with their husband and their children. At one point, I was on a bus, and I noted that in the bus there was a process of communication with the smugglers, the coyotes. The bus parked on the side of the road, but there was a house where the migrants were already hiding. I saw how they came out and they got on the bus. And you can tell when the women get on with their children, their young children. They're not teenagers. They might be 7, or some of them were being carried by their mothers. So what that tells us is that women are migrating. Not specifically because of climate change, but rather they are migrating because of issues of structural violence, because of what is happening in their countries, because of the violence being suffered in their home, violence against women, because of household violence, domestic violence, but we also believe that one of the causes or underlying causes of violence against women is because they don't have the conception, the idea that they're migrating because of climate change. Women have access to land, but really women don't have financial resources to properly invest in the resource of land that they have. So the fight of women in this migration process is due to domestic violence, but it also is linked to climate change. There are natural factors in our area, the scarcity of water, the constant mudslides, which are affected in families, crops. But the reality is we see that an important factor in this process of climate change has to do with the lack of economic opportunity. We also believe that the state, in this case, the state of Guatemala, should invest much more in women producers, because we recognize that there are women who are producing on their territory, but they don't have the capacity and the skills to come up with a product that can be successfully marketed. We think the state needs to invest more in all of these processes linked with climate change and migration.
Muchísimas gracias, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for everything you explained to us. You talked to us about the situation on this border. Generally, we're not very aware of that. And thanks for explaining to us the alliances that you set up among defenders on the border and all your work of political advocacy. What you were mentioning was also very important. You don't have data about that process, about that entire pathway through which women are emigrating and how they are linked to climate change. And that is one of the demands that we've been calling for years. There's a lack of statistics, there's a lack of data, and without these statistics, it's impossible to come up with public policies with an intersectional perspective. So thank you for everything you've contributed. And with that, I would like to move to Andrea with all that political advocacy and the establishment of local and global agendas on climate justice. We wondered, Andrea, if you could explain to us how you marry these two perspectives from a feminist perspective, and what is your work in the women and gender constituency in the UN, and what are the objectives in CSW 66? And we're already in the second week of the commission. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for everything you've shared. Let me explain to you what the Women and Gender Constituency, the Women and Gender Constituency is one of the 9 groups of the stakeholders on the framework for climate change. In other words, we're an official observer. We were established in 2019, and WGC is made up of 33 organizations from civil society, environmental organizations, and feminist organizations, including my organization. We do to ensure that feminists are integrated in all climate change deliberations of the UN, so that gender equality and women's rights have a central role in international debates. So our members are present in every meeting of the framework convention and also in the intersessional meetings. And we also work with the secretariat, with the governments, with civil society observers and other stakeholders to guarantee that human rights and gender justice are central elements of these deliberations. So to be more specific about what we really do, I want to talk to you about what we did during COP26. And now I put the two documents in the chat, one which is in Spanish, which were our key demands for COP26, which was the climate change conference in November in Glasgow. I also included a document of key issue reports. We did summaries on losses and damages, reproductive rights, important issues for climate change. And COP26, aside from publishing reports and demands, what else did we do? We met with governments, we organized protests and actions. There was a huge protest in Glasgow which was on Action Day. There were various action blocks. We were in the feminist block. There was an indigenous block that was on the streets of Glasgow. And we also held actions at the COP to speak out on behalf of our colleagues and activists, not only those who were unable to be there in Glasgow or because they were victims of xenophobic or racist discrimination, or because their grassroots organizations hadn't been funded. So we were speaking out on behalf of all the people who weren't there. We also spoke out on behalf of assassinated or disappeared environmental disappeared. We also advocated digitally, and we also carried out a campaign of 100 people. We were wearing masks that said feminist climate justice. And every day we were wearing a different colored mask in order to highlight a different demand of the documents that we had sent. It was very important that various delegations, such as that of Mexico and some of the progressive delegations, used our masks during the negotiations. That was part of what we did. And since we were an official observer, we were able to make official interventions. And we also had daily strategy meetings with ecofeminists, and we also organized various official events. And now to talk about the CSW, which is the Commission on the Status of Women, which is taking place right now here in New York. Unlike the climate change process and COP and CSW, we don't have a work method that allow civil society to officially participate in the negotiations. Women and Gender Constituency is an official organ observer, but various feminist organizations have organized informally, like the Women's Rights Caucus, to come up with an agenda based on human rights and feminist rights. We really like to be part of groups, as you can see. So one of the objectives and one of the key issues that we have in the CSW is, first of all, as I was saying, we want governments to understand that gender issues and climate issues are addressed intersectionally and systemically. As Yuria, Carolina, and Blanca also mentioned, there is a patriarchy and extractivism which got us involved in this climate crisis, and we can't address these problems without a fundamental change in the system. And another key issue is when we talk about gender and climate. These are not just sexual and reproductive rights is because women have been violated through climate change, but we also have to talk about climate financing. We need financing for women on the territories, grassroots women, indigenous women who have many of the solutions that we want for climate change, but they're not being heard and they're not being financed. Another issue which is really important is that of losses and damages. As you know, and we mentioned in this session, because of the patriarchy, women are most affected by disasters, and they are less taken into consideration for economic losses and damages. It's really difficult to know what women have lost because of climate change, because they work informally and they work in subsistence and caring professions, and they're very important for food sovereignty. So this issue of losses and damages is something that the governments of the global north don't want to discuss, and they don't see this as being related to gender, as our colleagues were saying. This is something which is clearly linked to gender. And lastly, another very important issue in the CSW is one objective is that governments need to understand that it's not just climate change and gender justice and economic justice. Countries like mine that are going through a huge foreign debt crisis, that doesn't allow these countries to address climate change, and that's why economic justice has everything to do with a solution to the climate crisis. Those are some of the issues that we've been pushing here at the CSW.
Muchas gracias, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.
Sí, la verdad es que el rol que tenemos, ¿no? Las feministas, las activistas feministas, las
the role that
sociedad civil
feminists have here, especially from the civil society at the CSW and other global and local spaces, is being cut back. It's true that the participation has to be in every sector. I want to ask Yuria, with respect to the participation of indigenous women, before you said women are not given a voice, as if they didn't exist. And I wanted to know now what responses are indigenous women providing in the face of climate change, and how do you evaluate their participation in political participation? What is the extent of their participation?
Sí, bueno, muchísimas gracias también por crear estos espacios.
Thank you for having created this space, which is so necessary.
La participación de nuestras las hermanas que hablaron anteriormente.
And thanks to my sisters who spoke before, there are some data which are very important. And one of them is the lack of disaggregated data, which don't allow us to analyze interventions or resources. And that is something that creates more problems than the ones we've been mentioning up to now. And this lack of participation and this inability to see the presence of women and girls, we can see that from the fact that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed in 2007, and there's no real legal framework legally binding, no legally binding framework
Sí, bueno, que promueva estos derechos dentro de los estados, ¿no? Que se formen políticas públicas dentro de los estados y los gobiernos.
And for
Sí, gracias, muchas
yeah,
gracias.
yeah,
Legalmente vinculantes, ¿no?
legally binding frameworks
De los gobiernos.
from the governments.
El único es justamente este
And
del CEDAW, ¿no?
the only framework is from CEDAW, the Women's Commission. Much more needs to be generated, but that is an index of the fact that there's a lack of women's participation and lack of women's presence. Andrea was saying that there isn't sufficient political participation. And Andrea was saying that there is a need for financing and economic justice.
Y claro, ¿no? El conocimiento de las mujeres o el poder de las mujeres, ¿no?
And the recognition of women's power, especially in indigenous contexts, women who use their voices to affirm their existence. Indigenous ways of knowledge can truly be an articulation of identity, a reclaiming of identity which contradicts all these forms of domination that we talked about. Militarism, economic colonialization, patriarchy. And this way used by women and indigenous peoples in general, and these forms used by women and girls to revitalize and retransmit traditional knowledge has become a path of justice and empowerment. This sense of identity helps regain culture, power, and essence. Even when governments don't create those spaces, these spaces are being generated within communities, and now there's a greater possibility of disseminating culture through the social media, and we can create a possibility of a presence, and this presence will offer us a possibility to reposition women's and girls' voices and indigenous culture in the global framework. This, at the end of the day, challenges the dominant, established, oppressive culture and establish new narrative pathways based on community values that cultivate this care of the earth. I think that so far, as has been already mentioned many times, and that's why we're here today at this forum, indigenous women lack access to influence platforms in decision-making, which affect us directly and our communities. But other ways of advocacy have been sought out in addition to or along with political participation in the creation of public policies and legal frameworks. There are organizational possibilities and participation in community life through the transmission of traditional knowledge. That's why we talk about the importance of language, the revitalization of indigenous language, because it is through this transmission of culture that this identity can be maintained. It's a way of resisting the colonial processes of repression. In every role that women have, from mothers, sisters, transmitters of culture, tellers of stories, medicine women. Women have become, we have become a collective voice of resistance. We are recreating or recontextualizing a narrative on our own identity, where we are the recipients. We provide identity to whom we are, but how we can reorient social forces and channel them in a way that is relevant to our time and that will allow us to seek solutions, permitting us to address our social and environmental challenges worldwide, from the local level to the international level. These adaptations are a way of developing a new history. What is the present and how we can use traditions to create forms of freedom. Women as an agent of power who strengthens collective identity and continues to challenge these forms of domination through advocacy. I like to view this metaphorically as if women were these seeds of conscience that we sow in our hearts and in other people's hearts. But these seeds, at the end of the day, are derived from ancestral traditional knowledge in connection with the land. These are the threads we are sowing to create an empowerment society, a society of inclusion with access to well-being for all.
Muchas gracias, Yuria.
Thank you, Yuria, for highlighting the community participation as an alternative and complementary way of creating a new history to fortify these collective stories and as a way of justice for all these groups of women. And to continue with these responses and with this participation, Blanca, I wanted to ask you, what role do we ecofeminists from the global north, specifically in Catalonia, what role do we play and what can we do to support the struggles of our colleagues from the global south? What would be the strategies that we could carry out or that are being carried out? Well, to respond, I have to explain what ecofeminists are. I don't know how much time we have, but if we want to, we do want to mention that there are many initiatives, many struggles that are being carried forward to defend common rights from a feminist perspective. And we're at that crossroads with feminism and ecology. We want to fight an extractivist model in Catalonia and elsewhere. There are a series of struggles we're engaged in. As ecofeminists, we have a broad perspective. We can find ecofeminism in struggles in the rural world and in the urban world. The defense of resources and territories, for the defense of our time and our work, which is often not compensated, which is one of the central demands of a feminist economy. In rural sectors, the defense of our colleagues of the Delta del Ebra or the Costa Brava, or for the preservation of rights, and also for the defense, the struggle to preserve the countryside and the landscape. Energy versus food. There are eco-feminist campaigns that deal with this conflict. But in the urban environment, we work with people affected by mortgages or the Alliance Against Energy Poverty. These are groups that are very feminized because, as has been said many times, women have to deal with the burden of reproduction, although we say it needs to be, this burden needs to be shared. This use and distribution of resources, we are leading these struggles, and I've given you a few examples, but there are other platforms beyond energy sovereignty or housing emergency. For example, those platforms that defend water, for example, Water is Life. These are platforms that are made up of campaigns. Sometimes we engage in reflections on the redistribution of our work. Of care. We have a feminist outlook. We try to claim power at the same time. There are many radical criticisms of the current capitalist, heteropatriarchal, neo-colonial system. I think that the initiatives and the proposals we have could go from participating in a local energy community. These are alternative proposals that go against the energy oligopoly. And we say that energy should have a public and community perspective, also defense of municipalization in this sense. But I also wanted to emphasize that the defense of my colleagues of healthcare and public services is also a proposal that we view as being environmental, because socially necessary work are much less polluting than other industries. So consequently, we understand that eco-feminists are right here. And what are feminists from the global north doing to support our colleagues in the south? I think on the one hand, material support. Before we were talking about global chains of global supply chains. If we work for food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and we provide these people resources, we can break these chains, these global chains which are generated by extractivism. Consequently, I think that the dimension of consumption is important to be able to break this, and for there to be a consequence in the South for transnational companies not to continue to advance. So I think that the initiatives we can walk on here in the North in sovereignty already has an impact, which is support to what's happening with our colleagues in the global South. And since there are these global chains, we have to struggle so that the impact in our territory, we need to have all rights. We need to fight against unfair immigration laws. We should get the state to sign Convention 169 of the ILO. We need to engage in the anti-racist struggle. That is the dimension of our support. As some of my colleagues have pointed out, there are other perspectives. The Western perspective in terms of development, which is to emphasize other worldviews, other perspectives. That's what happens, in my opinion, when you have a perspective that is distant from this typically racist perspective, being able to work in network with common initiatives to exchange knowledge, to realize what our points in common are in our struggles, and to join our efforts to those of the Global South. There is a responsibility in the Global North from companies here. There is another initiative in the Catalan territory, which is to come up with a center to evaluate the impacts of Catalan companies abroad. That would be an important area for the civil society to organize such a center. We can support the Global South not being violated at all. That would be a very concrete initiative. The strategies could be individual or collective, or they could be at small scale, and also to support political advocacy campaigns that would combat these inequalities with campaigns that would explain what Global North companies are doing in the Global South. You would need to conclude. Those would be the 3 points. I believe our clear individual responsibility for consumption, we believe, can be carried out, but it also has limited repercussions. We are in the same situation. In order to be responsible in our consumption, the collective responsibilities of energy sovereignty and food sovereignty and smaller scale sovereignties, and which has an impact on the South, and also international policies, where we need to move towards political policies that will respect human rights. And that's all. I'm sorry if I went a little over time. Thank you. Thank you, Blanca. I'm sorry about that. And thanks for having mentioned these strategies based on the dimension of consumption, the fight against racism, the struggle to create political consciousness at different levels. I want to return to Carolina. What are your strategies and what are your feminist responses to the migration process? How are you women working? Can you give us a brief overview of the way you address women and how women participate in the process when they're immigrating directly or indirectly because of environmental causes? I know you said that not all of this information is present, but based on your perception and your projections. Thank you. As I was mentioning before, in our Mesoamerican coordinating group. We initially didn't have objectives, and our foci, but through our we've come up with a strategic vision of what we want to work on through the Mesoamerican Network. When you were asking us about to give you a broad overview of what we're doing as a Mesoamerican network to support and our legal approach and what is the status of women in immigration. That's been key to us as a network. And right now, we are supporting women with a comprehensive model, which we've built in meeting spaces on the network. We've managed to define what this comprehensive model consists of. And let me mention this generally because one of the important elements of this model is strengthening of internal internally of the people who make up the network. And as part of the network, we engage in partnerships and alliances outside the network. Now we work with a network of managers, which is an important organizational framework for us to increase skills and capacity. That's one element. Legal and health support is provided through the network through a multidisciplinary team where all that type of support, interprofessional support, is provided to women and their families in the immigration process. Based on this psychosocial support, we have a small house which is part of this model, where we can find the multidisciplinary team. Now, where there's specialists there who are available for this type of support. We've also done internal research. When I say internal, I mean at the community level, but we've also carried out research on the border to see what the context for immigration are and to see what the potential is. And we've tried to identify some actors who might be part of a potential future alliance. We've also worked on dissemination and advocacy and alliances institutionally. And as part of our support for FOCA, we are coming up with an interinstitutional space to engage in analysis and to see what processes we can communicate with organizations and institutions. We are also promoting rights. Those of us who are on the network in our countries are very much engaged in the work of interaction among the different populations at the community level. We take advantage of coordination spaces to inform people of their rights. We do contextual analysis of what it means to immigrate with rights. And based on what was said in the earlier intervention on our public spaces, we also established permanent ongoing dialogue with the authorities. I mentioned to you that we have spaces where we work with the consulates. Since we set up the network, we see a great need to work with authorities from each country to create work strategies and supporters for the various participants in the immigration process. Those countries that are on the network, each organization has their own specialty. For example, in El Salvador, the organizations on the network are more focused on defense of the land and the earth. In Guatemala, they work more on promotion of human rights and immigration. In Mexico, there is more emphasis on support, which is what I've been discussing with you. We also focus on observation as a strategy that can serve us to disseminate and to engage in advocacy. So I think it's important for us to work on support. So in this model, this has been useful for us to become familiarized with other types of leadership. We want to increase our membership, but also increase our network of managers to improve skills on immigration related areas in Guatemala. We know that there are some initiatives that are more focused on climate change because many years ago, there were communal consultations. Emphasis was given to mining issues and consultation on mining issues. There was an organizational plan to consult with the communities to know what the community's response was in the face of mineral extraction, and 100% of the community consultations that took place in the municipalities were against this mining. There was no agreement because there's a strong attachment to the land. There are also spaces of dialogue between the government and the civil society on these issues, but we see that there is no real advance in terms of a political agenda where the civil society and the state agree. We know from this process there have been some local organizations that have arisen which are committed to climate change and the defense of the territory. In the case of Guatemala, there was a great deal of persecution of these types of leaders. Some were jailed and they went through the justice process, and at the end of the day, it was not positive for leaders. We are very familiar with some of the cases. In this case, there's a Maya Canjoba leader who participated in this process and who was jailed and deprived of his freedom because he participated in the social organization process to defend the territory and the land. Thank you, Carolina, for sharing these strategies and this support, which is so comprehensive throughout Mesoamerica on that corridor and places women and their communities at the heart of this. You are defending immigration with rights. And since we're running short on time, let me go right to my colleague Andrea to ask if you can evaluate the results of the last COP26 in Glasgow, and what do you expect from this CSW? And furthermore, do you think that the work carrying out at the current Commission on Status of Women 66 can have an influence at the next COP27? Thank you, Laura. First of all, COP27. I'm going to explain to you a little bit about that in a minute, but as I was mentioning before, COP26 did not provide a line of financing for damages and losses caused by climate change. We need to continue to insist on this and work through the CSW for governments to understand that losses and damages is key for any discussion of climate change and gender. What did happen at the COP were that the parties and the countries agreed that the Santiago Network, which is a group of countries that would receive financing for financial technical assistance but they're only going to finance this technical assistance, but there's not going to be a mechanism created to finance losses and damages to meet the scale of need in the most affected countries and communities. This financing gap, which is extremely meaningful, something that we want to address in Egypt in COP27. This issue of losses and damages I mentioned to you is something that has been blocked by the rich countries, United States, Australia, United Kingdom, and the European Union, I say to the Catalans. And these countries are blocking that here at the CSW. Well, how did the COP let us down? The carbon markets, which we didn't want. For us, that's a false solution, but they were included in the already included in the Paris Accords, and now there are loopholes that don't have sufficient human rights and environmental safeguards. So we need to continue insisting here at the CSW and later at the COP for this entire issue of human rights be addressed from a human rights, women's rights, and indigenous rights perspective. As Blanca said before, we are on the way to more than 2 degrees of climate warming. And so those of us who are based in the global north need to point out that the rich countries who caused the crisis need to act with global justice in mind and should stop their emissions. They should be more generous in their national determined contributions, NDCs, and also in COP26 we saw a focus on private sector solutions, false solutions, as we said, from the feminist movement and groups like Net Zero and geoengineering in spaces like COPE and many international spaces. We are seeing, especially in the UN, that the private sector is seen as, well, they're going to save us. But we know that social movements and civil society, because the private sector has its focus on income. Another thing which is important when we talk about COP26 and then the CSW and the Egypt COP in November, it's important to be consistent among all the processes, policies, and international dialogues from the UN so that these issues are not debated in silos and there should be no regression on agreed upon language, because at sometimes we achieve an advantage in language in one area. That language is not brought to another space. And so this is an economic problem. This is a social problem. This is an environmental problem. This is a gender problem. When we know that with our systemic approach, it's all linked. And we don't want any more backsliding. We want this to be viewed as intersectional issues with a systemic root and a systemic solutions. To give you 2 additional examples for CSW and COPE, we need to connect with the high-level political forum, which will take place in July here in New York, where there'll be specific review of the SDG 5, which has to do with gender equality. We need to continue these processes with what's going on in Geneva with the human rights process. For example, with CEDAW, number 37, where there are recommendations for the member state to combat gender-based violence in the context of natural disasters. We need to continue to make these connections among all these processes. But to address your question, Laura, it's not that I am very hopeful about the CSW helping us towards COPE and that all this will be the solution, because my hope is not in governments throughout this process. My hope is in the power of feminist groups for climate justice and gender justice. And we are organizing and constructing power and solidarity. At the end of the day, we as civil society, as feminists, are going to create the futures we need. And these spaces and projects are sort of tools where we can ask for this future, we can create mechanisms. It's also like an exercise to think what macro solutions can bring us to the world that we want to see. Thank you, Andrea, for this reality bath. But as you said, it's important to continue to work to achieve consistency among all these processes and to continue to keep your eyes on the high-level forum, on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, on the COPE and the CSW. And even if it means these spaces are tools, you continue to be there. And thank you for all your hard work. And so as a final section, I was wondering if you could tell us what your major demands that you're making from the major actors, multinational organizations, civil society, governments, the citizenry, to address the struggle for climate justice from a feminist perspective. Just give me a brief sketch, thumbline sketch.
Supongo que seguiremos, ¿no?, con el orden de los panelistas.
So I think we'll maintain the same order as before.
Y bueno,
well,
me parece que la sabiduría de los pueblos indígenas
I think that the wisdom of indigenous peoples has incredible potential to help us reorient all human activities precisely to create environmental and community consciousness with love for the earth, precisely because indigenous wisdom is based on community, is based on a collective good, on living well, which of course includes the health of the planet. We cannot have human health without planetary health. So there are some specific demands that need to be taken into account to achieve these ideals. Among them, protect individual and collective rights, and those of the indigenous peoples in general, but above all of indigenous women and indigenous women and girls, and which includes rights in the territories, to protect nature, to save Mother Earth, protect ecosystems means to protect all vulnerable groups. It means protecting women. In this way, we are also protecting traditional knowledge and those who are transmitting it to future generations. When I listen to these voices of the peoples, of the communities, of the women and the girls who are experiencing these challenges, there is clear evidence of the situation of the ecosystems, and this shows us what the direction we have to take to restore these biocultural asked us is, and we said we need to have a perspective that will consider the realities, the present and past discrimination affecting women and girls, at the same time that we consider the entire constellation of factors that women and girls are that lead women and girls to be exposed to such an arbitrary situation. Above all, the problems of displacement from territories because of climate change and because of violence. To understand, when I talk about narratives, we need to understand these narratives historically. What were the realities and experiences of the past, which today continue, and what are the needs of women in relationship with the protection of these human rights? Interculturality must really need to be taken into account. These different decisions should come from a cultural diversity that will respect the various worldviews and the different languages that exist, the wide variety of cultures and languages that exist, and appreciate the diversity offered by women, this diversity of disciplines, in order to be able to intervene in public policy and to generate development possibilities having to do with health, education, rights, and culture. It is a joint task, and these perspectives can help to prevent these conflicts expanding and will allow us to look for real solutions. I hope that it will be possible to recognize the beings of the lands that live here as our own family, and that we should move to embrace the original inhabitants of the lands. We need to recognize their rights to these lands, and we should view them as relatives, both human and non-human. We should view them as being the people who give us our home. We should convert their land into a garden for the feeding of all. Thank you, Yuria. Before I give the floor to Nuria, I want to remind you that if you have any questions, you can ask the questions through the chat. But we will, I don't know if we'll have time, but if we do, we'll make sure you get the questions. What is your perspective, Blanca? I'll be very brief. I think it's extremely important to ask the governments to come up with concrete measures beyond their institutional declarations. To give you an example, in a city such as Barcelona, we have to deal with four administrative levels that declared a climate emergency: the European Union, the city of Barcelona, the state of Spain. But we need to move towards a proposal for another model. I don't know if we're in time to overturn the current impacts, but at least we need to put the brakes on them. We need to have proposals that are directed at each at government departments. There's a department which deals with climate change, but all of this is structural. If we have proposals that deal with the business economy, which has a different logic, which is much more geared to consumption and construction, which is committed to a model of this scale, we'll never get there. So consequently, beyond institutional declarations, we need concrete measures, just like Andrea, who explained very well the results of COP27. I understand these spaces can be very difficult. I can understand that our feminist colleagues don't feel comfortable there because it's not the way we usually do things, or these are not our principles, but I think that we have to continue to our work from a critical perspective, because the whole perspective of greenwashing, people talk about the new economy of care. I say we have to avoid these false solutions. We have to distribute our consumption. So a few people have a lot, and we have to work with the communities and the public, because the mercantile, the private sector is profit-oriented. Our proposals exist, but we have to raise them to a higher level. We have to continue extending our proposal, and that's what we need to request of governments. That's all I would say for the moment. Thank you.
Gracias, Blanca.
Thank you, Blanca. Carolina?
Si quieres compartirnos algunas de las demandas o tus propuestas.
Would you like to share some demands or proposals with us? Yes, if I were to engage in an analysis of the question, it would really be interesting for us to present demands to governments from our perspective on the territory. It's important to seek out a way of having an influence on public budgets. We know that the state governments have approaches to this problem in society, but how we influence all these budgets. For example, in Guatemala, we have the experience of working on this issue, and we see that the public budgets do not reflect these proposals. You don't see proposals aimed at dealing with immigration or climate change, but these are proposals that are aimed at construction processes, projects having to do with iron and cement. So we have to continue working on public budgets, and we should have them deal with climate change and the defense of territory and land. As a civil society, I believe that it's important for us to have an influence on public policy. We can construct processes of consultations with society, with groups, and come up with proposals for public policies on projects that are more environmentally friendly and more friendly to the local populations. Another important process from this approach would be the issue of involving other types of actors in these processes, in this case, young women, and give them this perspective of immigration and the linkage with climate change. And also to create alliances. How do we ally ourselves as a Mesoamerican network with other organizations that have similar objectives, so we can have a stronger network? We'll be able to make changes in our country's structure. I was talking about the fact that women don't have financial resources and economic resources. How can we create seed funds to contribute to women and carry out actions to combat climate change? And the other point would be to find a way to increase the percentage of royalties, if royalties are perhaps 25%. of that 25%, a good percentage of those royalties should be oriented towards women. And we would need to come up with some general working lines to devote a percentage of these royalties to immigrant women. That's what I would say from our network of our Mesoamerican network perspective.
Muchas gracias, Carolina.
Thank you, Carolina. Andrea. Thank you. I would say that the main message, as we've been saying, is that we need a systemic change. That's our main campaign as a women's major group, which is one of the coalitions that we too is part of. We need to leave extractivism and capitalism and move to more feminist perspectives based on care and regeneration. But for the governments specifically, I would ask them to pay attention to feminists, to the activists, and to the indigenous peoples, and they should include us in decision-making processes, and they should include us on their delegations in places like CSW and COP, where our participation is increasingly limited, especially during the pandemic. As we heard from Carolina, we need governments to truly protect human rights of environmental defenders. They need to ratify the Escazú Accord. As Carolina explained, we also need governments to assign less public budgets to police and military entries and allocate more to climate action, the economy of care, and public health programs and social protection. We need governments to challenge corporate power and false solutions as no more sacrifice areas, no more land grabbing, no more single cropping and greenwash, as we say. We want the governments from the global north to stop their emissions and make a transition to non-exploitive economies and to economies which emphasize regeneration and care. As I've said, we need financing for losses and damages. The rich countries need to pay what they owe to the former colonies, especially small islands. And this climate financing needs to be feminist, and it needs to be transformative, gender transformative. The civil society needs to become mobilized and to join those movements struggling for structural change, and it should struggle for intersectional systemic change. And the advocacy of these movements needs to be led by women from the global south, by Afro-descendants, trans women, and LGBTQT women. It's not just a matter of having a seat at the table and women's leadership, as we've all said, but we really need to have structural change that will transform our economic and social systems so that they will truly work for collective liberation of everyone. And we need to push our governments, especially, as we said, the people in the global north. And finally, I would say that vision you need to think of the future and be radical in your demands. You need to dream of a world where girls, women, and people of different genders and indigenous peoples have sovereignty over their land. You should imagine a world with climate justice, with sufficient financing for basic climate solutions, a world with gender justice, and climate reparations for the most affected, because this is the world that we're going to build together.
Gracias,
Thank you,
bueno, gracias,
Andrea.
Blanca,
Thank you,
Carolina,
Yuria,
Andrea,
Blanca, Carolina.
por
Thank you, all of you,
propuestas,
for your proposals
bueno, por todo, bueno, por estar aquí, por
and for having been here, for your presentations.
Bueno, nos quedan 10 minuts.
We have 10 minutes.
No sé si tenim algunes
I don't know if you have any questions.
Si no, podem... Bueno, li puc donar pas a la presidenta
I could
del
give the
Consell
floor
de les Dones
to
de
the
Catalunya,
president of the National
Institut Català de
Council
Dones,
of Catalan Women and the Catalan Institute of Women, Meritxell Benedí,
perquè clausuri i tanqui
for you to
aquest webinar.
close this webinar.
I res, i segueixo amb l'agraïment, no?, de
A-
totes.
And I would express my thanks to all. Thanks to Laura. Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Yulia, Blanca, Carolina, Andrea. This was truly an enriching session. One of the participants was mentioning this right now. It is a source of pride to be able to hear all these voices and to hear that we all share the same diagnosis, that the patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism makes us all sick physically and environmentally and geologically. And this shouldn't be cause for celebration, but it is that we share the diagnosis in Catalonia or in Latin America or in Mesoamerica. We aren't so far removed from each other. And that is a cause for hope, because certainly our solutions will be shared and we'll all be rowing in the same direction. For me, I would highlight a few things that I've heard today. There is resistance to this patriarchal, colonial, elitist, LGBT phobic structure. I could mention all these elements of intersectionality. There is resistance to this hydra, and this resistance is feminism or intersectional feminism, anti-racism, and the struggle against colonization. I'll leave with a new word, which is nostalgia. I was unaware of this word, Julia, and I take a note, and I'm going to take away the need to give ourselves sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, care sovereignty, to break the chains that justify this from the government of the General of Catalonia. We women are committed to feminist transformation, but there's a long way to go. We know, and we can't deceive ourselves, that to feel feminist or anti-racism will not put an end to all the crises that we're facing as women today. Thanks to all of you for your participation. I think we have our work cut out for us. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. I don't want to hold you up. I know we have to digest this wealth of information we've heard today. Thanks to the government of Catalonia for organizing this session. It was a pleasure to hear you, and I hope we'll see each other soon. Thank you very much.